"This constitutes Islamophobia," she declared, her voice fracturing upon the syllable as tears coursed down her cheeks. "This represents racism masquerading as supervision, and the American public perceives the truth within it." The entire chamber suspended its respiration as Representative Ilhan Omar rose at the testimony desk within the Rayburn House Office Building, room 2154. 7 exhausting hours into her deposition, her self-possession ultimately fractured into pieces. She wept openly, not as a performance, but with genuine, raw emotion. She recounted the narrative of the refugee encampment, the conflict, the 12-year-old girl possessing no English skills, the lethal threats, and the assailant who had lunged at her with a syringe only the previous week. For 30 seconds, she commanded the absolute attention of the room. For those 30 seconds, she garnered sympathy even from individuals who opposed every conviction she held. Then, she uttered the word Islamophobia. Immediately, the atmosphere transformed because everyone present had been observing for 7 hours. Throughout those 7 hours, Speaker Mike Johnson had not referenced Islam a single time. Johnson paused, waiting with immense patience until she resumed her seat. He waited until her attorney placed a comforting hand upon her arm. He waited until the audience quieted, the whispering ceased, and the C-SPAN lenses focused upon his visage. When he finally spoke, his voice maintained the same even, clinical pitch it had held all day. It was the voice of an auditor reciting a column of figures that failed to balance. "Congresswoman, I have not alluded to your faith a single time today, not even once. You may verify the official transcript, for I have not cited your race. I have not referenced your hijab, your immigration standing, or your personal history." He retrieved 2 sheets of paper from the desk, elevating them so the cameras could capture 2 congressional financial disclosure documents. "These are the dullest records in Washington, the variety that no one ever bothers to peruse. I have discussed only these, your specific documents, your figures, and your autograph." He positioned them adjacent to one another. "This record states your household net worth was $158,000. This subsequent one declares it is now worth up to $30 million. You receive $174,000 annually, yet in 7 hours, you have not justified a single dollar of that discrepancy." He gazed directly at her. Then he shifted his focus to the gallery, looking at the Somali-American women who had traveled by car from Minneapolis. These were Muslim women from her own district, her own constituents. Are these women Islamophobic? Are they racist? They desire to know the exact same information that I wish to know. He paused briefly to ask where the funds originated. Silence followed. It was the heavy sort of silence that cameras adore and politicians dread. Omar's mouth parted and then shut again. Her attorney whispered something, but she shook her head, offering no response. It was that specific silence which would headline every news broadcast. It would not be the tears, nor the refugee narrative, nor the allegations of persecution, but the silence of a woman unable to justify her own bank balance. To comprehend how they arrived at this moment, one must see how a congresswoman who outlasted Trump, survived death threats, endured removal from committees, and withstood being labeled a terrorist on cable news nightly, for 6 years ended up undone by a paper she signed herself. You must go back in time. 8 hours prior, Ilhan Omar walked into the Capitol believing she understood what was approaching, unaware that Mike Johnson intended to ignore her identity. He planned to read her receipts instead. It was shortly past 8 in the morning when she sat in her Longworth Building office, examining talking points with her staff. David Brennan, her attorney and a K Street veteran who billed $800 an hour, having guided 6 Congress members through ethics complaints, sat opposite her with a legal pad filled with expected inquiries and practiced replies. "Standard playbook," Brennan remarked, noting they would inquire about feeding our future. "You had absolutely no involvement with it. They will inquire about campaign finance." The FEC dismissed that complaint in 2021 via a unanimous decision. "They will ask about your financial disclosures. Everything was filed properly. If they press regarding Tim's companies, we defer to your husband's right to conduct private business without congressional interference." Omar nodded while scrolling through her phone. Her notifications were already flooding in. Progressive allies were posting support, while squad members tweeted solidarity. The hashtag Defending Ilhan was climbing. The political machine was functioning. It always functioned effectively. Every assault on her transformed into a fundraising cycle, a media tour, and a chapter in the saga of a refugee who refused to break. "They have been investigating me for months," she stated. "If they possessed anything substantial, we would know by now. This is red meat for the mega base. It is the same tactic they always employ. It is the same thing Trump does whenever his numbers decline. They attacked the Muslim woman from Minnesota." She placed her phone down and looked at Brennan. "Honestly, this might actually be beneficial for us. The primaries are approaching. Every time Republicans drag me into a hearing, my small-dollar donations spike. Let them waste their time." Brennan did not entirely share her optimism. Attorneys are paid to worry, yet he perceived no legal exposure. The FEC complaint had been dismissed. Her disclosures were filed. The fraud cases in the district were ugly, but she was not named in any of them. As far as he could tell, this hearing was a political exercise, and political exercises were Omar's home turf. Her chief of staff, Ela Bashir, had the media strategy mapped out. "The second they go after you on anything Somalia-related, we pivot to the refugee story. If they bring up the fraud cases, we point out you were never charged, never implicated, and never named in any indictment. If they hit your finances, Tim's businesses are his businesses. You have student loans. You have been transparent." "I have been transparent," Omar said, and she believed it because she had told herself the same thing so many times it had calcified into conviction. The FEC had dismissed the complaint. The financial disclosures were filed. The fact that Tim Minate's company had gone from being worth $1 to being worth $25 million in a single year was just good business. The fact that she had refused to disclose his exact ownership stakes was her right. What she did not know, and could not have known, was that 3 blocks away in the Speaker's office in the Capitol, Mike Johnson was preparing something she had not anticipated. It was not an attack on her identity, not a conspiracy theory about Somalia, nor even a criminal accusation, but something much simpler and much more devastating. He was going to read her own paperwork back to her. Johnson sat at his desk with Tom Emerson, his chief counsel and a former assistant U.S. attorney who had spent 12 years prosecuting public corruption in the Eastern District of Virginia. Emerson possessed a reputation for being meticulous and humorless, which made him excellent at his profession. "Walk me through the sequencing one additional time," Johnson requested. Emerson flipped through his outline. "Phase 1 involves the district. We establish exactly what occurred. Feeding our future involved $250 million stolen, 78 individuals indicted, and 56 convicted, almost all within her district. We make the situation tangible. We read the names and sentences while displaying the map. We establish that this did not happen in some abstract location. It occurred in the 5th Congressional District of Minnesota, which she represents. Phase 2 is proximity, Safariland, the fundraisers, and the staffer who was convicted. We demonstrate she was not merely a bystander. She was physically present in the room. She knew these people. Phase 3 involves the money and her financial disclosures. The jump from 158,000 to potentially 30 million. Tim Minate's businesses, the E Street Group payments, the winery fraud allegations, the cannabis deal collapse, and the OFAC freeze. We do not accuse her of theft. We simply ask where the money originated and watch her fail to answer. Phase 4 is her own words. We play the clips, including the Benjamin's tweet, the Somali speech, and the defense of fraud investigators being racist. We allow her to contradict herself using her own voice. Phase 5 is the shield. We demonstrate the pattern. Every time someone investigated fraud in her district, someone cried racism, and she amplified it. She gave it legitimacy. She made it harder for law enforcement to protect her own constituents. Johnson nodded. Keep the tone clinical. Emerson said it must be prosecutorial with no emotion, no name-calling, and no culture war. We never mention her religion. We never mention her race. We never mention immigration. We discuss money, documents, votes, and her own recorded statements. If she introduces identity, that is her problem. We speak only about receipts. Johnson felt the heavy burden of what he was about to do. He was not attempting to destroy someone. He was attempting to hold someone accountable. There was a difference. At least, he believed there was a difference. "Let us proceed," he said. At 9:45, both factions converged on the hearing room. Omar entered through the main corridor, surrounded by supporters. Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib walked beside her while cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. She stopped to provide a brief statement. This hearing is a political hit job designed to silence a black Muslim woman who speaks truth to power. I will not be silenced. I will not be intimidated, and I will continue fighting for my constituents and for justice. The statement was polished and practiced. It would make the evening news. She appeared exactly the way she intended to look, strong, defiant, and unbowed. Johnson entered through a side door carrying his binder, avoiding cameras and looking like an accountant heading to an audit. The hearing room filled until every seat was taken and the press gallery was packed. The gallery presented a split screen of America. Omar's supporters wearing purple shirts that read, "We stand with Ilhan," sat on one side, while on the other sat a small group of Somali American women who had driven from Minneapolis. They were not wearing political shirts. They wore the faces of people who had something to say and had waited a long time to say it. At 10 o'clock sharp, Johnson gavelled the hearing to order. The Committee on Oversight and Accountability will come to order. We are here today to examine questions of fraud, accountability, and constituent representation in federal assistance programs, with a specific focus on events in Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. His voice was dry, procedural, and deliberately boring. This was not theater. This was paperwork. Congresswoman Omar, you are here pursuant to a subpoena. You have the right to counsel. You have the right to make an opening statement. Do you understand these rights? I do. Would you like to make an opening statement? She stood, looked at the cameras, and drew a breath. Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. She delivered the speech she had rehearsed, the refugee story involving the camp in Kenya, and coming to America with nothing. Learning English, working hard, becoming a citizen, and being elected were all true, moving, and irrelevant to what was about to happen. Everything I have done has been in service of my constituents, she said. I have spent my career fighting for refugees, for immigrants, and for working families. I did not commit fraud. I was not charged with fraud. I was not named in any indictment. This hearing is a political exercise designed to punish me for being who I am and saying what I believe." Her supporters applauded. Johnson allowed it to run for a few seconds before quieting them. "Thank you, Congresswoman. That was a moving statement. Now, let us examine the record." He opened the binder to the red tab. "Let us start with what happened in your district." Johnson pulled up a map on the screen behind him. Minnesota's 5th Congressional District covers Minneapolis and the surrounding areas. On the map, red dots marked the locations of Feeding Our Future meal distribution sites that were later identified as fraudulent. There were dozens of them, nearly all clustered in Omar's district. The map looked like it had a rash. The Feeding Our Future scandal, Johnson began, is the largest pandemic-era fraud in American history. A nonprofit called Feeding Our Future claimed to distribute meals to children through the federal child nutrition program. During COVID, when schools were closed, the program expanded dramatically. Feeding Our Future went from handling $3 to $4 million annually to claiming reimbursements for 91 million meals. He let that number land. 91 million meals. Except most of those meals were never served. The sites were fake. The attendance rosters were filled with invented names. The invoices were forged, and the money, $250 million of federal funds meant to feed hungry children, was stolen. He read from the Department of Justice press release. Stolen and used to buy luxury cars, vacation properties, jewelry, and commercial real estate in Minnesota, Kenya, and Turkey. Some of the money was wired overseas to accounts in Mogadishu. 78 people have been indicted, and more than 56 have been convicted. The ringleader, a woman named Amy Bach, was found guilty on all counts this year. Most of the other defendants are members of the Somali American community, your constituents, Congresswoman, people who live in your district and people who voted for you. He began reading names slowly, one at a time. Mohammed Ismail, 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $47 million in restitution. Abdi Aziz Farah, 9 years. Abdi Majid Noor, 6 years. He went through a dozen names. Each one was a constituent. Each one was a federal conviction. Each one was a story of money stolen from programs designed to feed children. The room was silent, except for his voice and the scratch of reporters' pens. In the gallery, a woman pressed her hand to her mouth. She recognized some of the names. She lived on the same block as one of them. He had driven a 10-year-old Toyota until the fraud money came in. Then it was a BMW. Everyone on the block noticed. Nobody said anything. You did not say anything. Now, Congresswoman, when did you first become aware that there were problems with this program? Omar shifted in her seat. Her lawyer leaned forward. Congresswoman Omar was never involved in the Feeding Our Future organization and had no role in it. I did not ask about her role, Johnson interrupted gently. I asked when she became aware. The Minnesota Department of Education flagged irregularities as early as 2020. Their inspectors visited sites that claimed to serve thousands of meals a day and found empty rooms. No children, no food, and no evidence that a single meal had been served. The department tried to slow reimbursements pending review. And what happened? He answered his own question. Feeding Our Future sued the state, claiming the investigation was racially motivated because many of their operators were Somali. A Ramsey County judge, Judge John Guthman, actually held the Minnesota Department of Education in contempt of court and ordered them to keep paying while the lawsuit was pending. The investigation was crippled for months. Millions more dollars disappeared during that delay. Did your office support Feeding Our Future's position? Did you or your staff communicate with anyone involved in the lawsuit? Did you make any public statements supporting the claim that the state's oversight was racially motivated? Omar started carefully. I have always stood against racial profiling in all its forms. I am not asking about racial profiling in the abstract. I am asking about this specific case, a $250 million fraud and an investigation that was delayed because someone cried racism. Did you support that narrative? He clicked to a video. Omar at a press conference, not from the Feeding Our Future case specifically, but from early 2026, speaking about the broader federal fraud investigation in Minnesota. Her voice filled the hearing room. There is no reason for them to use this level of rhetoric. There is no reason for them to fully stop these programs. The only reason they are doing that is for PR purposes. Johnson stopped the clip. $250 million stolen, 78 people indicted, 56 convicted, and you called the investigation PR purposes. Were the convictions for PR, Congresswoman? No answer, just a glare. Johnson shifted to the blue tab. His voice stayed level, almost conversational, like a man reading from a spreadsheet, which in a way he was. Let me ask about Safari Restaurant. Omar's jaw tightened slightly, barely perceptible, but the cameras caught it. Safari Restaurant in Minneapolis was co-owned by Salim Saeed, who has since been convicted of wire fraud in connection with the Feeding Our Future scheme. According to trial evidence, Safari was one of the original fraudulent meal sites. It is a restaurant with approximately 40 seats. It claimed to be serving thousands of meals per day to children. He pulled up a photograph. Omar at a community event. The location was Safari Restaurant. The photo was from a local Minneapolis news outlet covering a campaign season community gathering. You held events at this location, multiple events. You knew the owners. Your opponent in the 2024 primary, Don Samuels, stated publicly that Safari Restaurant was a political hub in the Somali community. He said that if you are going to be in politics, you need to go through the people at the Safari Restaurant because they kind of control the politics. A former member of your own staff was also convicted in the Feeding Our Future case. Omar shifted. Mr. Speaker, attending community events is literally my job. I attend events at churches, mosques, restaurants, and community centers. I understand that. And I would not bring up a restaurant visit if it were just a restaurant. But this restaurant was claiming federal reimbursements for thousands of meals per day. Its co-owner is now in federal prison, and you were there regularly enough that political operatives in your district considered it essential to your political network. Omar's lawyer interjected. Mr. Speaker, attending a community event at a restaurant does not imply I agree. Johnson said attending an event does not imply anything on its own. But I am establishing proximity. The question the American people are asking isn't whether you personally filled out fake meal count forms. The question is whether the largest fraud in American history happened all around you, in your district, among your supporters, at locations you frequented, involving people on your staff, and you somehow noticed nothing. You, who pride yourself on being the most connected, most attentive, and most community-engaged representative in Congress. He leaned forward slightly. A restaurant with 40 seats, claiming to serve thousands of meals a day to children. Operators driving new BMWs and buying investment properties in Nairobi while running supposed children's nutrition programs out of storefronts with no kitchen equipment. Did none of this seem unusual to you? I do not audit restaurants. No, but you defended the people who were supposed to be auditing them. When investigators tried to look into it, you called it political persecution. When federal agents were sent to Minneapolis, you called it confusion and chaos. When convictions started coming in, You characterized the entire effort as an attack on the Somali community. He paused. Who were you protecting, Congresswoman? Your constituents, or the people who were stealing from them? The room stirred, and a murmur rose from the gallery. One of the Somali-American women from Minneapolis wiped her eyes. She did not look angry. She looked tired. Johnson opened the green tab. This was the section that mattered most, and everyone in the room could feel the shift. The district questions were context. The Safariland questions were proximity. But this, the money, was the kill zone. Let us talk about your personal finances. He held up the 2 disclosure forms again, side by side for the cameras. In 2022, your household net worth was listed as between $50,000 and $158,000. That is modest and relatable. That is what most Americans would expect from a member of Congress who talks constantly about student loan debt and economic justice. In 2024, your household assets are listed as potentially worth between $6 million and $30 million. Your husband's stake in a winery is valued at $1 to $5 million. His stake in a venture capital firm called Rose Lake Capital is valued at $5 to $25 million. That is a change of somewhere between 4,000% and 20,000% in 2 years. He set the papers down. Now I understand that asset values can grow. I understand that investments can appreciate. But let me walk through the timeline of your husband's business career, because the committee has done significant research, and the American people deserve to see it. Tim Minot, your husband since 2020, was previously a political consultant who ran a firm called E Street Group. Your campaign paid E Street Group approximately $3 million between 2018 and 2020 for consulting, advertising, travel expenses, and production costs. At one point, your campaign constituted 66% of his firm's total federal revenue. After the payments drew public criticism, you severed the campaign's relationship with E Street Group. Your husband then pivoted to new ventures. Venture number 1 is a California winery operated with his business partner, Will Haler. An investor has sued them, claiming they promised to triple his $300,000 investment and instead made the money disappear. The lawsuit seeks $780,000. Venture number 2 is a cannabis business in South Dakota. 3 marijuana entrepreneurs say they are owed $1.2 million from a failed deal with Minot and Haler's company. Venture number 3 is Rose Lake Capital, a venture capital firm. In your 2023 disclosure, you listed its value as somewhere between $1 and $1,000. 1 year later, it was worth between $5 million and $25 million. Johnson looked up. Let those numbers breathe. A company worth $1 becomes worth $25 million in 12 months. At the same time, the largest fraud investigation in Minnesota history is unfolding in your district. Your husband's previous firm was funded almost entirely by your campaign. His subsequent ventures have been accused of defrauding investors, and you have refused to disclose his exact ownership percentages in any of these companies, which breaks standard congressional disclosure norms. Omar's lawyer stood. Mr. Speaker, the Congresswoman's financial disclosures comply with all legal requirements. The values listed represent the total estimated value of the businesses, not necessarily her husband's individual share. Then what is his individual share? Johnson asked simply. Silence. If the listed values represent the whole business and not his share, then what is his actual share? 50%? 10%? Or 1%? Your disclosures do not say. Congressional norms call for that information. You chose not to provide it. Omar spoke, her voice tight. My husband is entitled to conduct business privately. You file joint tax returns. His income is your income. His assets affect your financial interests. And you serve on committees that vote on legislation affecting investment and business. The American people have a right to know whether you have financial conflicts. That is not persecution. That is the law. He pulled out one more document. I also want to note that one of your husband's companies had funds frozen by the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. This is the agency that oversees sanctions enforcement, terrorist financing, and money laundering. Can you explain why OFAC was involved with your husband's company? Omar's lawyer whispered urgently. She shook her head. We are not going to discuss pending legal matters, so there is a pending legal matter involving OFAC and your husband's company. More silence. The lawyer's face said everything. Johnson sat back. Let me summarize. Your campaign paid your husband $3 million. His businesses have been accused of fraud by multiple investors. One of his companies had funds frozen by the anti-money laundering arm of the U.S. Treasury. Your household went from being worth less than a used car to being worth potentially $30 million in 24 months. And you can't or won't explain any of it. He picked up the 2 disclosure forms one more time. Either these forms are inaccurate, in which case you signed false statements under penalty of perjury, or they are accurate, in which case you owe the American people an explanation for a level of wealth accumulation that would make a hedge fund manager blush. Which is it, Congresswoman? Johnson opened the yellow tab. He didn't reach for documents this time. He reached for his tablet. This was the section built on Omar's own voice, her own words played back in sequence to reveal a pattern she had never been forced to confront. Congresswoman, I want to play a few clips. All public record, all your own statements. He pressed play. First clip, February 2019. The tweet heard around the world, read aloud because tweets do not have audio. It is all about the Benjamins, baby. Omar's response to a question about why members of Congress support Israel. The bipartisan condemnation that followed. Her own party's leadership calling it out. Her apology. Johnson read the apology. Anti-Semitism is real, and I am grateful for Jewish allies and colleagues who are educating me on the painful history of anti-Semitic tropes. This is why I unequivocally apologize. He looked up. You apologized for suggesting that money buys political loyalty. You said it was an anti-Semitic trope to imply that financial interests drive congressional behavior. Do you stand by that apology? Omar hesitated. This was a trap and she could feel it, but she couldn't see where it closed. Her lawyer started to lean in, but she waved him off. She would handle this one herself. I do. I apologized, and I meant it. Good, I respect that. So the idea that money creates improper political influence is, in your view, a serious accusation, one that shouldn't be thrown around lightly. It should be made with evidence, not with stereotypes. Agreed. So let me present some evidence. Johnson's voice didn't change. Still flat. Still conversational. Still deadly. Your campaign paid your husband's consulting firm $3 million. After you married him, his company suddenly became worth millions more. You sit on committees that affect the industries his companies operate in. He has a stake in a venture capital firm that invests in businesses that may be affected by legislation you vote on. He paused just long enough. By your own standard, the standard you set in your apology, wouldn't it be fair for someone to ask whether money has influenced your behavior? Whether the $3 million your campaign paid your husband created any kind of improper loyalty? The room went quiet. Omar stared at him. That is completely different. Why? Because it is you? Because when someone else's financial relationships create an appearance of corruption, it is a legitimate concern, but when it is yours, it is persecution? He didn't wait for an answer. He moved to the second clip. January 27th, 2024. The Somali speech. Johnson played the actual video. Omar speaking in Somali to a room of constituents at a Minneapolis hotel. He showed the viral translation that had spread on social media, the one that claimed she said her top priority was to put Somalia first. Then he showed the independent translation from PolitiFact and the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, which said the viral version was distorted. "I want to be fair," Johnson said. The viral translation was inaccurate. Independent translators confirmed that you were speaking about the Ethiopia-Somaliland dispute, over sea access, and encouraging civic engagement. "I am not going to use a bad translation against you. That would be dishonest." Omar visibly relaxed for 1 second, the briefest flicker of relief. But that single word pulled the tension back like a bowstring. You retweeted a translation of your own speech that read, quote, "While I am in Congress, no one will take Somalia's sea." You retweeted that yourself from your own verified account, not a hostile translation by your enemies. Your own account, sharing what you considered an accurate summary of your own words. He showed the retweet on the screen, Omar's handle, the quote, the date. "Is that an accurate reflection of what you said to that room? I was advocating for my constituents' concerns about a foreign policy matter. You were pledging your congressional office to a foreign country's territorial dispute. You didn't say, 'I will advocate for a diplomatic resolution.' You didn't say, 'I will raise this issue through appropriate channels.' You said no one will take Somalia's sea while I am in Congress. You made your seat in the United States Congress into an instrument of Somali foreign policy. And you were proud enough of that statement to share it yourself. House Majority Whip Tom Emmer, your own state's Republican whip, called those remarks appalling and demanded an ethics investigation. Governor Ron DeSantis called for your expulsion and deportation. Those were overreactions. I am not calling for your deportation. I am asking a simple question. When you told a room full of Somali Americans that while you are in Congress, no one will take Somalia's sea, were you speaking as an American congresswoman or as a representative of Somalia?" He played the third clip, January 2026. Omar on Face the Nation, talking about the federal fraud investigation in Minnesota. Her voice again unmistakable. There is no reason for them to use this level of rhetoric. There is no reason for them to fully stop these programs, funding these programs. The only reason they are doing that is for PR purposes. Johnson stopped the recording. The room was very still. $250 million stolen, 78 indictments, 56 convictions. Children in your district went hungry because the meals they were supposed to receive were never served. The money was spent on luxury cars and real estate in Kenya and Turkey. Some of it was wired to Mogadishu, and you called the investigation PR. He leaned forward. Were the 56 convictions for PR? Were the 12-year prison sentences for PR? Were the children who didn't get fed just props in a Republican PR campaign? Omar started to respond, but Johnson wasn't finished. Let me tell you who your community actually needed you to protect. He nodded toward the gallery. Those women right there, they drove from Minneapolis. Somali American mothers whose children were enrolled in these programs. Children who were supposed to get meals and didn't. One of them reported it to your office. Your office never responded. A gasp from the gallery. Then quiet. One of the women in the gallery nodded. She wasn't performing. She was confirming. Omar looked at the gallery. For the first time in the hearing, something flickered across her face that wasn't defiance. It looked like recognition, like she was seeing for the first time that the people she claimed to represent were sitting in the room and they were not on her side. "Who were you protecting, Congresswoman?" Johnson's voice was quiet now, almost gentle. "When you called the investigators racist, when you called the federal presence unnecessary, when you said it was all for PR, were you protecting your constituents? Or were you protecting the ecosystem that was making your household very, very rich?" He pulled up one final timeline on the screen, simple, chronological, devastating in its clarity. 2020. State investigators flag irregularities in feeding our future. The organization accuses the state of racism. The investigation slows. A judge holds the state in contempt and orders them to keep paying. 2020 to 2022, fraud continues unchecked. Another 100 million disappears. Money flows overseas, and children go unfed. 2022, FBI raids, indictments begin. You characterize the scrutiny as political attacks on the Somali community. 2023, convictions start. Your household net worth begins its dramatic climb. 2024, your financial disclosures show assets worth potentially $30 million. You refuse to explain the wealth. 2025 to 2026, more convictions. Federal investigators estimate total fraud across multiple Minnesota programs may reach into the billions. You go on national television and call the investigation confusion and chaos. You say it is for PR. He pointed at the timeline. Every step of the way when someone tried to stop the bleeding, the race card was played by the fraudsters, by their lawyers, by the organizations, and by you. You gave it legitimacy. You gave it a congressional seal of approval. You made it politically dangerous for any investigator, state or federal, to ask hard questions about fraud in your district, because they knew that if they did, a sitting member of Congress would accuse them of racism on national television. And the ringleader of the entire scheme, the woman at the center of all of it, was Amy Bach, a white woman. Prosecutors described her as using fake claims of racism to silence oversight. A cooperating witness called her God because of how much power she held over the network. She weaponized identity to protect corruption. And you, Congresswoman, whether you knew it or not, helped her do it. He paused. Let the room absorb it. Do you understand what that did? Not to the investigators, they did their jobs anyway eventually. But to your constituents, to the Somali American families who reported fraud and were ignored, to the mothers who told their children's schools that the meals weren't coming and nobody listened. They couldn't get help because the system was afraid of being called racist, afraid of the narrative you helped build. This was the part where it was supposed to fall apart for Johnson. This was the part where Omar was supposed to rise, give the speech, summon the full force of her story, the refugee camp, the journey, the American dream, and turn the hearing into a rallying cry. She stood, her voice shook, but not with weakness, with anger. I came to this country with nothing, she said. I fled war. I lived in a camp for 4 years. I came to America as a 12-year-old girl who didn't speak English. I worked. I studied. I became a citizen. I was elected to represent my community, and every single day since I took office, I have been attacked for being Muslim, for being black, for being born in Africa, for wearing a hijab, for daring to exist in this space. The gallery was riveted. Even Johnson listened. I have had death threats. I have been called a terrorist. A man charged at me with a syringe just last week. The President of the United States suggested I staged my own assault. And now you sit here in this committee room and you use my community's pain as a weapon against me. You use the fraud that hurt my people as a tool to destroy me." Her voice cracked. "I didn't steal anything. I didn't commit any fraud. Every investigation into me has found nothing. The FEC dismissed the complaint unanimously. And still you drag me here. Still you parade my family's finances. Still you question my loyalty because that's what you do to people who look like me." She was crying now, not performing, actually crying, and for 30 seconds the room felt it. The weight of her story, the reality of the threats, the ugliness of what immigrants in public life face. 30 seconds where she was genuinely sympathetic. Then she made the mistake, the one we saw at the beginning of this story. "This is Islamophobia," she said, wiping her eyes. "This is racism disguised as oversight. And the American people see right through it. And now you know what happened next. You heard it at the top." Johnson waited. Let her sit down. Let the room settle. And then he picked up those 2 sheets of paper, the same 2 pieces of paper he'd been holding all day, the most boring documents in Washington. And he said the words that would end up on every screen in America by midnight. "Congresswoman, I have not mentioned your religion once today. Not once." But hearing it again in context, after 7 hours of testimony, after the money trail and the safari land photos and the Benjamin's trap and the Somali speech played back to her and the timeline of fraud she'd called PR. Hearing it now, it landed different. Heavier, final. "I haven't mentioned your race. I haven't mentioned your hijab, your immigration status, or your background. I've talked about financial disclosures you signed, campaign payments you authorized, statements you made on camera, positions you took publicly." He held up the 2 disclosure forms. "These are your documents, your numbers, your signature. If being asked to explain a 20,000% increase in your net worth is Islamophobia, then what do you call it when your own constituents ask the same question?" He turned to the gallery. "The Somali American women. Are they Islamophobic? Are they racist? They're Muslim. They're Somali. They're from your district. And they want to know the same thing I want to know. Where did the money come from?" Omar sat. She had nothing left. The refugee story, which was real and powerful and true, had been deployed in the wrong place at the wrong time, aimed at the wrong accusation. Johnson hadn't questioned her loyalty or her faith. He'd questioned her bank account. And the refugee story doesn't answer a financial disclosure. Johnson straightened his papers. "Let me bring this together." He spoke directly to the camera now, to the American public. "Here's what we know. The largest welfare fraud in American history, $250 million, happened in Congresswoman Omar's district. Her core constituents were both the victims and, in many cases, the perpetrators. Federal and state investigators tried to look into it. Each time they did, they were accused of racism. Congresswoman Omar amplified that accusation. She called the investigations political persecution. She called them PR. While this was happening, her household wealth exploded. Her campaign had paid her husband $3 million. His subsequent businesses have been accused of defrauding investors. One had funds frozen by the Treasury Department's anti-money laundering agency. Their combined assets went from $158,000 to potentially $30 million in 24 months. She refuses to disclose her husband's exact ownership stakes. She refuses to explain the wealth. I am not accusing Congresswoman Omar of fraud. That's for the Department of Justice to determine. I am saying that the American people deserve answers, and today, in 7 hours of testimony, she has not provided a single one. He picked up a prepared statement. Based on the evidence presented, this committee makes the following referrals. First, to the Department of Justice for investigation of the accuracy of Congresswoman Omar's financial disclosures and potential conflicts of interest. Second, to the House Ethics Committee for failure to comply with disclosure norms regarding spousal business interests. Third, to the Internal Revenue Service for review of joint tax filings in light of the discrepancy between reported income and asset growth. Fourth, to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence for review of Congresswoman Omar's security clearance pending the outcome of these investigations. Each referral landed like a stamp on a document. Administrative, bureaucratic, devastating. Congresswoman Omar, Johnson said, "You are not being charged with anything today, but you are being asked to answer questions you have refused to answer, and the American people will draw their own conclusions from your refusal." He closed his binder. This hearing is adjourned. He stood. The committee members stood. They filed out. No drama, no shouting, no theatrical pronouncements. They left the way accountants leave an audit, quietly having done the math. Omar sat at the witness table. Her lawyer was talking to her, but she didn't seem to hear him. The cameras were still rolling. Her supporters in the gallery were chanting something, but it sounded far away like noise from another room. The Somali-American women from Minneapolis were already walking out. They didn't look at her. She'd come into the hearing as a symbol of immigrant resilience. She was leaving as a woman who couldn't explain her own bank account. The clips went viral within minutes. Not the emotional moments, not the refugee speech, not the accusations of Islamophobia. The clips that spread were boring. Devastating but boring. A side-by-side of two financial disclosure forms, $158,000, $30 million on a $174,000 salary. That was the tweet. That was the TikTok. That was the headline on every news site by evening. The New York Times ran it straight. Omar hearing raises unanswered questions about wealth. The Washington Post from 158,000 to 30 million. Omar's financial disclosures under scrutiny. Even outlets sympathetic to her couldn't avoid the math, because math doesn't have a political party. Progressive allies tried the usual defenses. AOC called it a witch hunt. Tlaib called it Islamophobia. But the problem was that Johnson hadn't mentioned Islam, hadn't mentioned race, hadn't mentioned Somalia, except in the context of a fraud scheme with 56 federal convictions. He'd talked about numbers on forms she'd signed herself. The defenses didn't stick because they were aimed at attacks that hadn't been made. The polls moved not dramatically. Americans don't change their minds about politicians overnight. But the question planted itself, where did the money come from? And it was the kind of question that doesn't go away because there's no satisfying answer. If the money is legitimate, show the receipts. If the receipts are private, explain why. If you can't explain why, people will fill in the blanks themselves. In Minneapolis, the Somali-American community response was complicated. It wasn't the unified defense Omar had counted on. Some people rallied behind her. Others were quieter. A local imam gave a Friday sermon about accountability that didn't name Omar, but didn't need to. When someone claims to speak for us, he said, we have the right to ask, are they speaking for us or for themselves? The women who had gone to the hearing gave an interview to a local station. One of them, a nurse named Halima, said something that cut deeper than anything Johnson had said in the hearing room. I came to America as a refugee just like her. I work 60 hours a week. I pay my taxes. I follow the law. And when people in our community stole money that was supposed to feed our children, she called the investigators racist. She didn't protect us, she protected them. And now she's worth $30 million, and I'm still paying off my daughter's school lunch debt. Another woman, Sahara, a small business owner who ran a halal grocery, added, "We are not a shield. Our identity is not a defense attorney. When someone steals from our children and then hides behind our pain, that is not representation. That is exploitation." It wasn't anger in their voices, it was exhaustion. The exhaustion of immigrants who played by the rules, watching someone who at minimum looked away while others broke them and then calling every question about it bigotry. They hadn't come to Washington to destroy Ilhan Omar. They'd come because they'd been waiting for someone to ask the questions their congresswoman wouldn't answer. And they were tired of waiting. The House Ethics Committee opened a formal inquiry within a week. Not into fraud that was the DOJ's territory, but into the financial disclosures. The specific questions were narrow and bureaucratic. Did the disclosures accurately reflect the value of the assets? Why were spousal ownership stakes not specified? Were there unreported conflicts of interest? Boring questions, the kind that end careers not with a bang, but with an audit. Omar held a press conference the next day. She called it political persecution. She called it Trump's vendetta. She invoked her refugee story again. She did everything she'd always done, the script that had always worked. But something had shifted. The question wasn't about her identity anymore. It wasn't about Islam or refugees or Somalia. It was about a number on a form. A number she'd signed. A number that didn't add up. She kept talking. The cameras recorded her. But the question just sat there, patient and immovable, like Mike Johnson sitting at the head of that committee table with his color-coded binder, waiting for an answer she would never give. 158,000 to 30 million on a government salary in a district where 250 million vanished from programs meant to feed children. While the congresswoman called every investigator racist and every investigation a witch hunt. The math didn't add up. And in Washington, when the math doesn't add up, the story writes itself. She never explained the money. She never disclosed her husband's ownership stakes. She never answered the question about why she called the largest fraud investigation in American history PR. She never addressed why her office didn't respond to the constituent who reported that her children's meals never arrived. She never explained how a company worth $1 became worth $25 million in 12 months. She just kept saying the word Islamophobia into cameras that had stopped believing it. Not because Islamophobia isn't real. It is. And she genuinely suffered from it. But because you can't use a real wound to cover a fake alibi. Eventually, people stopped looking at the wound and start looking at the numbers. And the numbers were right there on the forms she signed herself under penalty of perjury in black and white. Where did the money come from? She never said. And in Washington, what you don't say is louder than anything you do.